If you were to look at the most successful podcasts at the moment, they have a lot of commonalities. For instance, they all release content consistently, they have a commitment to releasing high quality content, and they are constantly pushing the envelope, innovating, but also streamlining. And last but not least, they're not doing it alone. If you were to continue asking yourself what also makes them successful, is that they have someone who's called a content strategist, a podcast content strategist, who is responsible for making sure that all of these elements are in place, but also that the podcaster has created content that makes sense for their brand, for their listeners, and for what's happening in the industry. So, in this podcast episode of the podcast space, I'm going to break down exactly what a podcast strategist is and how they can help business owners and leaders create a podcast that becomes world-renowned while ensuring a high return on investment. Welcome to the podcast space. I'm Anna Xavier. I'm an award-winning podcast marketer and content strategist, so I am so thrilled to break down exactly what I do as a podcast strategist and how do I help maximize not only the investment of the podcast itself, but also how I help clients get unstuck and find the gaps in the marketing and the opportunities that they have. They may have not seen it before. Let's dive into this week's episode of the podcast space. All right, let's dive into the kind of like the quick and dirty guide into what a podcast strategist is and isn't, because I get that question all the time. And the first thing to know is that they can be hired as a consultant, but also an in-house hire. And they can do exclusive content, or they can become, for instance, like a producer. So they can accumulate a couple different roles. But something to understand is that a podcast strategist and an editor are very different roles. So sometimes people come to me and say, hey, Anna, I started a podcast and I hired this company. They were podcast editors and I ended up feeling like I didn't get to my podcast goals. And I'm like, yeah, because if you look online for anything that has the title strategist on it, that requires a specific skill set that's going to be a more thorough job as someone who is editing copy or editing audio. And what I mean by this is that a podcast strategist is going to likely be more expensive than a podcast editor or a podcast producer. And that can be across any industry, really. So making sure that, for instance, if you receive an email or if someone quotes you like $200 to do a podcast content strategy for your show, well, it's likely going to be either a very generic strategy or it's going to kind of be a little bit of a scam. So be careful and mindful of pitches that you get. And last but not least, a podcast strategist doesn't always mean that they are a podcast marketer. So someone can just exclusively look at the strategy for your podcast and not necessarily look around for like your newsletter or your website or your social media. So one thing does not mean the other. I happen to be both, but just know that those limitations, if you're thinking about hiring one, you need to be mindful that, they're not going to be looking at your whole strategy. Okay, first things first. What does a podcast strategist do that is different than most podcast producers, for instance? Well, they are a data-driven decision maker instead of just a gut feeling. So basically, when you're talking to a podcast strategist, they're likely to want to look at your data, your podcast data, want to look at demographics, understand your audience better. So this is going to be for whether you are launching a podcast or if you have a podcast that is actually not delivering on the results that you wanted. So, for instance, they're going to look at your podcast formats. They're going to be looking at topics and making sure that your audience is targeted. A lot of times when you're launching a podcast, you may be kind of guessing who you're talking to, but looking at the podcast dashboard at a lot of the metrics that are provided within podcast dashboards and Apple Podcasts and Spotify, your podcast strategist is going to be able to help you make recommendations for format, adjusting format length, but really is going to find what is actually resonating with your audience and what isn't, and with your business goals, your timeline. So a lot of times podcasts are, sold as like the one solution for all of your business problems. But hiring a podcast strategist is going to help you make sure that whatever you're creating, you are delivering, but also it's resonating with the end goal. And so looking at the data as well is making sure that you're not missing out. So a lot of times, because podcasts have a lot of moving parts, it's not uncommon for podcasters to really excel in specific things. And maybe when you're looking at the basics, you realize that there's a huge gap that is really slowing down the growth of the show. And so ensuring that that timeline is adjusted to your content expectations and how the content is performing is really important, because many times people come to me and they say, hey, I launched this podcast episode. I'm looking at these metrics. Why isn't this connecting? And sometimes it's just because it's too soon to make that evaluation. Or maybe it's because, and again, I'm going to talk a little bit later on, is just there's a gap in the process along the line. So basically, we're missing out on information or missing out on conversions because there were some important steps that were missed. Now, number 2. Podcast content experts can help maximize your return on investment, your content opportunities, and understand listener behavior on listener apps. And what I mean by this is that a podcast strategist is going to look at episode consumption data and retention, and it's going to help you understand what you need to change in order to increase that listener engagement. So again, looking at the data and looking at what are the things that you're naturally good at, right? So for instance, podcast episodes solos. And when I'm looking at the format and I'm seeing like this content is really good, it's hitting in all of the goals that the podcaster has, but why is this podcast episode not as high of download numbers? Why aren't people engaging as much? And maybe I realized that actually when I look through what has been done, maybe the host, because it was the first solo episode, they were really shy and they didn't necessarily promote the episode as much as they did with a guest, for instance, or because normally the type of guests that they invite have an additional reach that they don't have. And so we're going to look at a little bit of a gap in comparison to the way that the other episodes perform. But the reality is that when we're looking maybe at the downloads or the listens or the plays, that episode may not perform as well. But when we look into social media, maybe that episode had a lot of engagement from the audience there. So what is really important is looking at how can we keep the listeners engaged for longer. A podcast strategist is able to assess, for instance, this is a very common mistake, is that podcasters are commonly placing ads just kind of like whatever. And a lot of times listeners complain a lot that when an ad falls in the middle of a sentence of an answer, it really doesn't like land well. And so that is a clear example of how it is disrupting the listening experience and disrupting that engagement with the listeners. So again, something to really keep in mind. Another thing that I think is very, very important, and it is like more on like the marketing side of it, is that a podcast strategist is going to help you understand which platforms are converting and when you should expect them to convert and what it means by converting, right? Like what is getting new listeners and what is the type of podcast promo, for instance, or podcast content that you should use to promote that episode, and what type of engagement is that going to lead to? Because not all pieces of content are created equal, and some will instill people to feel motivated and to share with a friend and share it on stories, and other pieces of content are going to instill people to comment, right, and engage there. So understanding like what are the social media platforms that are actually leading to engagement, what formats are working with the listeners, but also understanding if you're, let's say, sharing the content in 5 different mediums, and you may not get a ton of engagement, but you actually get a lot of people who move from that post into the episode. That is something to keep in mind, that it works, right? We have to look deeper into the data to understand what is actually leading people to engage, or maybe it's leading to messages. They want to have those conversations in the DMs, and that's a way hotter lead than someone who's just commenting on your posts. Cue in the dishwasher sound. So getting into the things that you want to make sure is that if your team is spending a lot of time and resources in sharing content for a specific platform that is not really necessarily like resonating, you may want to remove that piece. So that's how you're getting your return on investment. And so something to consider as well is that when you're talking about which platforms make the most sense is like when we're looking at podcast hosting platforms, what are the ones that actually your audience is listening in based on where they are, what the data is telling us, but also where the most opportunities for engagement or whatever you want to have in the future. So it's not just what you have right now, it's how to get us there. And then number 3 is reviewing the active and the passive marketing actions. On episode, I think is episode 79, I'm talking about how your profile on podcast platforms is actually passively attracting or rejecting that listeners. So making sure that we have the information that's going to get them there. And something that it happens all the time is really assessing not only where your podcast is, but how can we grow. And when we're looking at the listener path, we're looking at podcast hosting platforms, YouTube, social media profiles, websites, and understand when listeners are dropping off. And that is everything that we are talking about, the copy. We're talking about accessibility. And when I talk about accessibility, is for instance, is a button not very visible? Are the colors not optimal for people to click on? Or for instance, the platform doesn't perform very well on mobile. It takes forever to load. And we know that if a page takes more than a second to load, sometimes people like close the app and leave. Those are things that we need to think about. We're looking at broken links. And it's not the first time that I just kind of like, let me check out this person. And I look and I see that they have outdated links linking to maybe a platform that is no longer available, or they're telling people to join their email list. And that email list is, I knew that they were not using that platform anymore. You're missing out on listeners through that, right? When we're looking at an episode that converted really well, we have to understand what our listeners are looking for, but also the format. How is this format resonating with our listeners on podcast platforms? Is it too long? Is it too short? Are people listening time and time again, right? When we're looking at the content, is there content mismatch maybe in the level at which they are talking about? Is one of the most common scenarios that I encounter is, and this happened with a marketing agency, was talking about marketing advice, very basic marketing advice, like stuff that is basically like marketing one-on-one. And if you're talking to a brand, they don't care about marketing one-on-one, right? Like they want someone who can do it for them. And so none of the podcast content was about that. It was like very almost like DIY. And so it made no sense what her goals for the podcast were, which was to bring business into the business. And they were constantly getting messages about people who were like, hey, can you explain this? Can you explain that? Where in reality, they actually needed content that was more on the elevated side, more talking about the need and the importance and the outcomes of having, for instance, an agency do the work for you and talk about case studies and talk about things that they have achieved and the things that basically any company who is looking to hire a company to do the marketing for them would look for, not necessarily like the how to do it. Because if someone is learning how to do it, then they may not have a 5-digit budget or 6-digit budget for a marketing agency. So that was like a clear example of that. And so like, what is the approach? Is your approach too friendly? Are you giving away too much content? A lot of these things are based on context, right? That will be done by a podcast strategist. And that brings me to my next point. The podcast industry changes fast, and you are an expert at your own skill set, not necessarily at podcasting. And I feel like business owners sign up to newsletters and learn all the things, but like they don't understand what is actually tailored to them. And there's so many platforms coming and going in podcasting, so many AI tools that can make your life easier. But I hear from a lot of podcasters who are using all these tools and they kind of like, one, feel like they're spending a lot of money and there's a lot of overlap in what these platforms do, or there's just so much out there they don't know which one is the best. So a podcast strategist is going to be making sure that your podcast has the best practices. The podcast industry has changed so much, especially with the introduction of YouTube podcasts and how like a lot of new requirements are going to boost some people's content and are going to help them grow whilst others are going to stagnate because they're not following these best practices. And you don't always need to create video content, but like if you do put your content on YouTube, like what are the best practices that you can get to get your content seen? And a clear example of this is one of my clients. She was asking me, I know that YouTube is growing a lot. Should I put the catalog of all content on YouTube? And we kind of assessed what made most sense in her case. But again, if you look on the internet, there'll be people saying, yes, put it in. And other people will be like, no, just put your best content. So it can be hard to determine what makes the most sense without feeling overwhelmed. And another thing that I want you to think about is, for instance, like in July 2024, Google Podcasts closed the platform because, again, Google owns YouTube. When we're looking from the strategy standpoint, if we keep sending people to this platform that is not active, we're not focusing our efforts on the platforms that actually are working for us. So as a strategist, I look at the dashboard and see, okay, if the most of our audience is going through Apple Podcasts, it's important to make sure that if we are sharing links, we're likely sharing an Apple podcast, right? But if it's just marginal, well, maybe we want to keep Apple and Spotify, or Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, like what makes most sense. But when you're looking at all of the options, it may feel like you're like, oh, okay, like what do I do? Where do I send them? Or do you send them to your website, depending on your goals? Again, it really depends on your goals with the show, your timeline, and your expectations of what you want listeners to do next. And then last, 5, a podcast strategist is supposed to find you the best strategy to monetize your podcast, or at least to help you stop bleeding money. And I see so many people throwing money at a podcast when they don't have their basics set, or they may have their basics, but basically they're investing money in the wrong place. And this is something that, every podcaster wants to make money, right? They may not be making money because, one, they don't want to. That's like a minority. And then normally most people want to cover at least their costs, their editing costs, or if they are not making money, is because they don't know. And this is so common. I talk to clients and they are using the model that the big shows are doing. So they're looking at a Tim Ferriss and going, oh, Tim Ferriss has sponsorships. I want sponsorships. When in reality, when we're looking at a Tim Ferriss podcast, they have the volume that most podcasts don't have. So it's not going to make sense for you to promote a code for like an affiliate product that's going to get you like maybe $5 a month, or not even $5 a quarter. And so what we're going to be looking into is going down the route of leveraging your expertise and your show to make money. And this is something that I always talked about many times, when you can have a podcast with under 1,000 downloads and you can be able to secure thousands of dollars in sponsorships because you are not following the volume model, which is the one that you need to have a big audience, a big following to be considered by big companies or to make serious money with affiliate codes. And if you have courses, and this is something that business owners struggle a lot with, and you may struggle as well, and that is to, when you're looking at what you have, a lot of people have products and services. And of course, if you have coaching, you're going to be able to monetize that to a higher percentage than just a 15% affiliate link. So if you have coaching that is a high dollar amount, like $1,500, I've been able to secure consulting work through one of these strategies, right? And my podcast has less than 600 downloads per month. And I think that is important to understand, again, what are your strengths as a podcaster? What are the strengths of your business? How long until do you want to see money? Like, is the money not the option? You actually want thought leadership, and basically like the podcast is the first step in other steps. People get very distracted by I could be making money by affiliate work. When in reality, when you're looking at how much money you could be making, again, it's like pure profit, removing the processing fees and removing a platform to host your courses or something. Like, it makes a ton more sense to focus on the products and services, but like, how do you incorporate that in your content strategy? How do we incorporate that into what you're going to be talking about the episodes, and how do you market those episodes? That's exactly why it's important to consult with a podcast strategist to understand, okay, if you have these goals for your podcast, what are the paths to lead you there? And looking at your resources, looking at your budget, looking at the capacity that you have, looking at your technical abilities and how fast you want those results. That is the key to creating unique, crafted podcast content strategies that are going to help you succeed. They're going to help you get to those results that you want, and not necessarily the downloads, right? Like, it's about everything else that is involved in that process of creating the content. And so if this episode opened up your eyes about the possibilities of hiring a podcast content strategist and understand how to better market yourself, how to better market your content, where you should be investing your time, you can book a free discovery call on my website at thepodcastspace.com, and you can learn how you can better utilize the podcast. And one of my favorite moments is to help clients have that realization that they have more potential than they ever thought possible, because they thought they were not ready yet, when in fact they could be monetizing and they could be using their expertise right away using the right content strategy. So I hope you reach out, because again, 2025 is just around the corner. And if you want to grow, you want to become the thought leader, you can do that right now. I've been Alexi here, and I invite you, as always, to keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.